Good evening, friends. You are welcome to our tutorials today. So, as MBC 202 on the aspect known as membrane biochemistry. In this aspect, we will be discussing on in general. So just pay close attention, so that when we continue, you get the full brief up about this stuff. So when you say membrane biochemistry, what is membrane biochemistry all about? Membrane biochemistry simply is the study of the structure, the function, and the biological significance or physiological significance of a membrane. Let me break that down. Membrane biochemistry is the aspect of MBC that deals with the structure, the function, and the significance of a membrane. So when you talk about membrane simply is that structure that separates or demarcates the cell from its exterior environment. For example, if you look at a cell, the cell normally have what you refer to as the cell membrane. This cell membrane helps to separate the cell from the exterior environment. So the cell is separated from its exterior environment by what we refer to as what? The cell membrane. So the cell membrane is part of what we refer to as the biological membrane. So biological membrane can be divided into two. So write that down. Biological membrane can be divided into two. Number one is what we refer to as the cell membrane. The cell membrane is also called the plasma membrane. And number two is what we refer to as the internal membranous structure or the intracellular membrane. So what are the two types of biological membrane that we have? Number one, we said the plasma membrane, also known as the what? The cell membrane. And number two is known as what? Number two is known as the intracellular membrane, also known as internal membranous structure. So you can say membrane together can be divided into what? Into two. Now you have to know the difference between the plasma membrane and the one we refer to as the intracellular membrane. So what's the difference between plasma membrane and intracellular membrane? The plasma membrane is the membrane that separates the cell, the entire cell, from its environment. Whereas the intracellular membrane separates each organelle from the cytoplasm of the cell. Now, moving towards my board, let me draw for you, show you the difference between the cell membrane and the what? And the intracellular membrane. Now, I hope you can see me clearly because we are moving on, we are moving forward. So I will draw for you the difference between the cell membrane and the what now? And the intracellular membrane, and give you so many differences between them. These differences are the things that you really need. Now, I hope you can see this. All right. Let's call this a membrane, or let's call this a cell. The cell has this structure which we refer to as the cell membrane. Cell membrane. I hope you can see this. Now, within the cells, you see different organelles. Let's say, for example, this is the nucleus, and this is the cytoplasm. So, nucleus and cytoplasm. This is the nucleus. Let's call this what we refer to as, let's say, the mitochondria, for example. Now, this node at the cell membrane separates the cell from the exterior environment, whereas the intracellular membrane separates these various organelles from their what? From the cytoplasm. So each organelle has its own intracellular membrane. Remember that point. The whole cell has one cell membrane. The whole cell has one cell membrane, but it has many intracellular membrane. So each organism has its own intracellular membrane, but the whole cell in general has one cell membrane. Now, the intracellular membrane is more than the cell membrane. In percentage, the intracellular membrane gives you about 90% of the biological membrane, whereas the cell membrane gives you just 10%. I hope you understand that. Now let me give you another difference. That's just one difference between the intracellular membrane and the cell membrane. The intracellular membrane, we say, the intracellular membrane gives you 90%, whereas cell membrane gives you just what? Gives you just 10%. That's one difference. Another difference between the intracellular membrane and the cell membrane. The intracellular membrane is found in eukaryotes only. You know, there's what we refer to as eukaryotes and prokaryotes. That you did in biology. Eukaryotes has what we refer to as the intracellular membrane, and it also have the plasma membrane. But prokaryotes have only the plasma membrane. Prokaryotes do not have intracellular membrane. I hope you get that point. Prokaryote has only the plasma membrane. It does not have intracellular membrane. But eukaryote has both intracellular membrane and the plasma membrane. Now, take note of this. The plasma membrane that is present in prokaryotes may fold within itself. The infoldings formed by cell membrane or the plasma membrane in prokaryote is called mesosome. Let me spell that for you. Mesosome. M-E-S-O-S-O-M-E. Mesosome. So mesosome simply is the infoldings of the what now? Of the plasma membrane found in prokaryotes. Very important to remember that point. So now we're able to differentiate and find out what is the difference between the intracellular membrane and the what now? Plasma membrane. With that, we move to the functions of biological membrane, both intracellular and plasma membrane. There are many functions of the biological membrane. One of them is that biological membrane keeps toxic materials away from the cell. There are some materials that would like to enter into the cell. If the membrane allows them to enter, they may cause damage to the cell. And that is one of the functions of the intracellular membrane. They help to do what now? They help to keep off toxic substance from the cell. They don't allow toxic substance to enter into the cell easily. The membrane also helps to perform what thinks about what enters into the cells or what leaves the cells. So that's another function. Another function of biological membrane is that biology about compartmentation. This is the cytoplasm of the cell. There are some activities that occur in the cytoplasm that do not occur in the nucleus. For example, there's what we refer to as glycolysis. It's a pathway. The glycolysis pathway is made up of 10 steps and therefore has 10 enzymes. These enzymes are all located in the cytoplasm. They do not enter into the nucleus. Why? It is because the membrane that is found in the nucleus do not allow them to enter. So they are located only in the cytoplasm. Therefore, glycolysis is said to be a cytosolic or a cytosolic pathway. So compartmentation, separating the cell into different compartments, is another function of the biological membrane. There are many other functions of biological membrane. We are not going to list them all. Look for the rest in your materials and your textbook. With that, we move to the next aspect. Then we're talking about the features or characteristics of a biological membrane. We are going to talk about the things you are going to see to know that this is a biological membrane. Number one that we are going to talk about is what we refer to as few molecule thick. The biological membrane is not very thick. It's not very thick. It is few molecule thick. Possibly, you may be asked this in your exam. What is the thickness of a biological membrane? The thickness of a biological membrane varies from 6 to 10 nanometer. Never forget this. Thickness of biological membrane varies from 6 to 10 nanometer. That's a potential exam question. It is few molecule thick. Another important feature of biological membrane is this. It is asymmetric. Another important feature, it is self-annealing. Another important feature, it has a closed boundary. One you never need to forget, a biological membrane is dynamic. So you can see as many features we are mentioning. Try to remember these features. We said it has few molecule thick, 6 to 10 nanometer. It is self-annealing. That's closed boundary. It is asymmetric in nature. These are some of the features of a biological membrane. After knowing this, you need to know what forms this biological membrane. What forms the biological membrane? Is the biological membrane formed by protein, carbohydrates, mineral salts? What forms the biological membrane? Simply put, the biological membrane is formed by three major components. Three components: the protein, the lipid, and the carbohydrates. Carbohydrate is found in small amounts. Just about 0 to 10% of a biological membrane is made up of carbohydrates. I hope you remember that point. 0 to 10% of a biological membrane is made up of what? Carbohydrates. More amount of a biological membrane is made up of what? The lipid and the protein. Now, let's talk a little on the lipid that forms a biological membrane. There are 4 major lipids that you are going to see in the biological membrane. You can remember these 4 major lipids using a mnemonic known as faith gets small sense. Faith gets small sense. Use this to remember the 4 major lipids that are found in biological membrane. Faith stands for fatty acid. Next, get stands for glycerophospholipid. Next, small stands for sphingolipid. Then lastly, sense stands for sterols. So what are the 4 major lipids that you are going to see in the biological membrane? Faith gets small sense, fatty acid, glycerophospholipid, sphingolipid, and sterols. Of these 4 major lipids we've mentioned, the most abundant is glycerophospholipid. So the most abundant lipid in biological membrane is called what? Glycerophospholipid. After this follows by sphingolipid. So they ask you this question: what is the second most common lipid found in biological membrane? It is what? Sphingolipid. This is a brief up on the what? On the lipid aspect. Let's talk a little on the protein. The protein that makes up the biological membrane determines the amount of protein that makes up the biological membrane determines the biological activity of that membrane. If a biological membrane is made up of many lipids, many proteins, that biological membrane will have much activity. So any membrane that is performing many functions, take note, that membrane has large amount of what? Of protein. So the protein ratio that makes up a membrane determines the activity of that membrane. After knowing that beautiful point, we are going to talk about now on the proteins. The proteins that makes up a biological membrane are divided into 2. There's one which we refer to as the extrinsic protein, also known as the peripheral protein, and there's another which we refer to as the integral protein, also known as the intrinsic protein. So what are the two proteins that you can see in the biological membrane? Peripheral protein, also known as extrinsic protein. Integral protein, also known as what? Also known as the intrinsic protein. Now, when you hear the word peripheral, what comes to mind? Peripheral means something that is found in the surface. So let's say, for example, this is a biological membrane. The peripheral proteins are the proteins that you just see at the surface. Whereas the intrinsic protein are the protein that winds around or moves between the two layers of the biological membrane. Now, peripheral protein, as you can see, can easily be removed from a biological membrane. But the intrinsic protein cannot be removed easily. So remember this, if somebody says, she is my peripheral girlfriend, it means there's nothing to you. You're just enjoying the moment. You are catching cruise. You can throw her away anytime. Peripheral girlfriend. But intrinsic means, you like her so much. You cannot leave her. She cannot leave you. So that's what intrinsic protein stands for. They are deeply rooted in the membrane. It is hard to remove them from the membrane. The peripheral protein can be removed by EDTA. It can be removed by changing salt concentration. It can be removed by changing pH. Many things can just remove the peripheral protein from the same membrane. But the intrinsic protein cannot be removed easily. It can only be removed by reagents, such as detergents. So, we refer to this as intrinsic protein, and this as what? Peripheral protein. You will see this question in your exam. Give an example of peripheral protein. Or they may ask you, ankyrin and band proteins are what? The example of what? Of peripheral protein. Ankyrin, ANKYRIN. Ankyrins are example of what? Of peripheral proteins. Now, we've talked about a little about the lipid. We've talked a little about the what now? About the protein. Let's talk a little on the carbohydrate content that makes up a biological membrane. Remember, we said the carbohydrate content that makes up a biological membrane is very small, varying from 0 to 10%. The carbohydrate that makes up a biological membrane is mainly known as oligosaccharides. So, we have monosaccharide, oligosaccharide, polysaccharide. Some people refer to them as monosaccharide, disaccharide, and polysaccharide. Anyway, just remember these points. Oligosaccharides are the major carbohydrates that makes up the biological membrane. Branched oligosaccharide. After knowing this aspect now, let's discuss on this lastly. Lastly, we are going to talk a little on what we refer to as the composition of these constituents in a membrane. What are the membrane that has many lipids? What are the membrane that has many proteins? We are going to look at classification of membrane into different aspects depending on what they have majorly. Now, if, for example, a membrane has high lipid and low protein, this type of membrane is called simple membrane. So what's a simple membrane? A simple membrane is a membrane that has high amount of lipid and low amount of what? Of protein. So you can classify membrane depending on lipid-protein ratio. Is lipid high? Is the protein low? The first classification, we've got in simple membrane. So simple membrane are those membranes that have high lipid, low protein. Give me an example of simple membrane. An example of simple membrane is what we refer to as, let me explain this a little so that you get it. There's what we refer to as the myelin sheets. Yes, it's an example of a simple membrane. The myelin sheet is a very important membrane. The myelin sheet helps to cover neurons. Yes, it helps for faster conduction of neurons. So if you have a myelin sheet covering a neuron, impulses moves faster in those neurons that have myelin sheets. Yes. For those neurons that do not have myelin sheet, impulses tend to be very slow. That is why I'm putting it to you now. Just remember this point, that myelin sheath helps for what? Faster conduction. And myelin sheath is an example of what? Of a simple membrane. So after talking about simple membrane, let's now talk about the second type of membrane, where the lipid ratio and the protein ratio is equal. Lipid and protein ratios is equal. We refer to this membrane as the intermediate membrane. So it's in the first membrane, simple membrane. Second membrane, intermediate membrane. The intermediate membrane has almost equal amounts of lipids and protein. An example of intermediate membrane is the membrane of erythrocytes. Erythrocyte is also known as red blood cell. So the membrane of the red blood cell is an example of intermediate membrane, which have almost equal amount of lipid and protein. When the amount of protein is higher than the amount of lipid, you refer to this membrane as complex membrane. So an example of complex membrane is the inner membrane of the mitochondria. Remember, I made mention of these points. The higher the protein ratio, the higher the activities that will take place in that membrane. Higher the protein ratio, the higher the activities that will take place in that membrane. So any membrane that has high protein and low lipid, we refer to that membrane as what? Complex membrane. Give me an example of complex membrane. We say an example of complex membrane is the inner membrane of mitochondria. So we've been able to classify membrane into three depending on the lipid protein ratio. Number one, we said we have what we refer to as what? As the simple membrane. Give me an example of simple membrane. We said myelin sheaths, which help for faster conduction of impulse through neurons. We said if the lipid and protein ratio is almost same, the type of membrane is called what? It's called intermediate membrane. Example of intermediate membrane is the membrane of erythrocytes. Then thirdly, we talk about another membrane which is known as the what? As the complex membrane, which has high amount of protein and low amount of lipid. Example of this type of membrane as complex membrane, we said it is known as the inner membrane of the mitochondria. So these are some of the membranes that you just need to know about, depending on their classification. Remember, I made mention of a point that membrane tends to be dynamic. Yes, membrane is not static, it is dynamic, it moves. So give me some example of the movement that membrane undergoes. There's what we refer to as lateral diffusion or lateral movements and transverse diffusion or transverse movements. So remember those points. Movement undergoes by these membranes: lateral diffusion or lateral movements, transverse diffusion or transverse movement. Talking about lateral diffusion. Lateral diffusion is a type of movement that is undergone by both lipid and protein. Yes, peripheral proteins undergoes lateral diffusion, and lipid also undergoes lateral diffusion. But while protein undergoes lateral diffusion in a very slow rate, lipid undergoes lateral diffusion in a very fast rate. Don't forget that point. Lipid undergo lateral diffusion in a fast rate. Peripheral proteins undergo lateral diffusion in a slow rate. The second type of movement is called the transverse movement. Membrane also undergoes transverse movement. The transverse movement is only undergo by lipid. Proteins do not undergo transverse movement. Remember that point. Proteins do not undergo transverse movements. Only lipid. And when lipid undergo transverse movement, they tend to be very slow. So lipids undergoing transverse movement tend to be what? Tends to be very slow. But with the help of an enzyme, they can undergo transverse movement at a faster rate. We call that enzyme lipase. F-L-I-P-P-A-S-E. So lipase help lipid to undergo transverse diffusion or transverse movement with a faster rate. Therefore, transverse diffusion is flip-flop diffusion. Flip-flop diffusion. Because flippers helps them to undergo that in a faster rate. Biological membrane can be divided into two. We separated them into two. We said we have the plasma membrane and also have what we refer to as the intracellular membrane. We looked at the difference. We talk about the function of biological membrane. We say the features or the characteristics of biological membrane. When further talk about the constituent, what forms biological membrane, we looked at these. After talking about that, we also discussed about the movements they undergo. The lipid can be used to classify membrane. So just try to remember these points. Watch this video continuously and tell your friends that we've started our live videos. With this means, we'll be able to transmit more information to you directly and live. Thank you very much for watching this video, and please try to send a simple note to me if you want us to improve in a way, or if there's something you want us to improve on. You can just send that to me. I guess you have my number. Thank you very much, and God bless you.